Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with the second of 4 mini-lectures on the Philadelphia story. Today we're going to talk about class romance and submissive women. You may recall last time I compared Mike Connor to Pip because his desire for status appears to him in the form of a romantic desire for Tracy Lord, similar to Pip's desire for Estella. I think that it works the same way with the audience. As viewers, our desire for Tracy is intended to spark a romance with the upper class. Like Native Son, this film arrives near the end of the Great Depression. Bigger goes to the movies to enjoy fantasies about sharing the lives of wealthy white people. These fantasies carry a special racial charge for Bigger, but simply as economic wish fulfillment, they were shared by millions of ordinary Americans of all ethnic backgrounds who had one thing in common, namely, the economic distress of the 1930s. Like Bigger, these moviegoers were deeply ambivalent toward the rich, for the same envy that drives us to identify with such characters in fantasy can make us resent them in real life. The Great Depression pushed class conflict in this country farther than it had ever gone. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to 4 successive terms as president, and he pushed through a series of political and economic reforms known as the New Deal that would have been unthinkable without a motive as powerful as the collapse of the world economy. Social Security, welfare, trade unions, the minimum wage, the 40-hour work week, all these basic features of the social safety net were passed in the decade before World War II. 20 years earlier, many of these reforms had been planks in the Socialist Party platform during the presidential campaigns of Eugene V. Debs. The same forces that transformed such previously radical ideas into government policy during the 30s also gave impetus to the Communist Party and fed the underlying sense of envy and resentment against the wealthy. Tracy's father, Seth Lord, is a banker. To American families who had lost their life savings in bank failures, a banker is not likely to be a sympathetic figure. But in this film, we as viewers learn the same lesson Mike Connor does. "I made a funny discovery," he tells Tracy, "that in spite of the fact that somebody's up from the bottom, he can still be quite a heel. And even though somebody else is born to the purple, he can still be a very nice guy." We learn the same lesson, and we learn it in much the same way, by experiencing the charisma of either Katharine Hepburn or Cary Grant, or both, depending on your preference. Through our desire for these glamorous stars, we are wooed by the movie to fall in love all over again with America's upper class. Our marriage with them went on the rocks back in 1929, and since then we've been flirting with class prejudice and the man of the people appeal of suitors like George Kittredge, who, as you may have noticed, has political ambitions. The movie woos us to throw aside the unsuitable suitor, fall in love again with our lords and masters, and rejoice in Tracy's decision to remarry a properly aristocratic partner who has reformed his ways and come back to her as a new man. Class romance is woven together with the sexual reformation of Tracy Lord, and this too is directly connected to the history of the 1930s. Women got the right to vote in 1920 after decades of campaigning by the suffrage movement and the Socialist Party. And the decade of the 30s was a time when women were making their way into the professions in significant numbers, asserting their economic and sexual independence as never before. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was widely admired by some and widely hated by others for the active role she took in promoting civil rights and other liberal causes. Not until Hillary Clinton during the 90s would we see another First Lady as politically active and as widely disliked for behaving as if she were her husband's political and not just his domestic partner. Female stars like Katharine Hepburn and Joan Crawford played powerful, articulate, independent women on screen, and Hepburn played the role off screen as well. She was liberal, outspoken, and unconventional. By the end of the decade, she was also increasingly unpopular. In 1938 or 1939, no one would have predicted that Katharine Hepburn would enjoy the longest and most distinguished career of any modern film actress, a career spanning 6 decades and including a record 4 Academy Awards. At that point, her film career seemed to be nearing its end. A notorious list of stars who had become box office poison featured Katharine Hepburn in the top spot. The Philadelphia Story was her comeback project, and as such, it was spectacularly successful. Film audiences fell in love with her all over again, and from this point on, her stardom would never be seriously in question. The film began as a stage play performed on Broadway in 1939. It was written especially for Hepburn by the playwright Philip Berry, who based the character of Tracy Lord directly on the actress who would play her. He even followed Hepburn around, noting her speech patterns and mannerisms while he was writing the play. Its purpose was to revive her career by humanizing her in a way audiences could relate to, and in this it triumphed. In effect, the story takes a strong, independent, even dominating female of the 30s and domesticates her. She has risen above her place in the scheme of things by divorcing her first husband instead of standing by him, and by supplanting her father as the head of her own family. The film's opening pantomime sketches this out for us in Freudian terms. Standing at the top of the steps, dressed in a nightgown that tells us she's been in bed, Tracy looks down on Dexter from above. She flings his phallic pipes and golf clubs at him in contempt. Do you know the Magritte painting featuring the caption, "This is not a pipe"? Yeah, it's true that the point is that it's a picture of a pipe and not a real pipe, but it's also a Freudian joke. So is this, as Tracy keeps one golf club to break over her knee in a classic gesture of castration. And, if you're not aware of it, the popular culture of the 30s, 40s, and 50s in America is absolutely saturated with Freudian themes. Dexter then follows Tracy back to the threshold of the house, threatens to punch her in the face, hesitates, and then shoves her rudely down. This moment communicates a great deal of information. Partly it tells us about the past, about the failure of Tracy's first marriage to Dexter and the violence he resorted to when she provoked him. But it also foreshadows the story to come, in which Dexter finds a more subtle and far more successful strategy for pushing Tracy off her pedestal and restoring her to a subordinate position. The film soft pedals this, of course. In the final scene, when Tracy promises to be Yar, she is only a little lower than Dexter, just enough to look up lovingly into his face, and he responds, "Be whatever you want," assuring us all that he'll be a benevolent lord and master. But Yar is a sailing term, and as Tracy explains to George in an earlier scene, it means easy to handle, quick to the helm, everything a boat should be. The analogy is partly sexual. Tracy, the married virgin, was obviously not easy to handle, and partly one based on control, for there's never any question with a captain and his boat who's in charge. The metaphor of sailing unites the two meetings, as if to say that a woman can be sexually responsive only if she is also subordinate to her male partner. I mentioned briefly that Dexter, who was an alcoholic, had to reform his ways in order to become Tracy's husband, but the movie doesn't show us his struggle. From the moment he reappears on screen in the offices of Spy magazine, Dexter is in charge, always in the background or off to one side, but always self-possessed, always amused, and always controlling the action. The film is interested only in his mastery, not in how he achieved it. This may remind you of Pride and Prejudice, where we saw Elizabeth Bennet's transformation from the inside, not Darcy's. Here, too, it is the reformation of Tracy Lord that the film centers on, and her reformation is just the opposite of Dexter's. Instead of achieving mastery, she has to give it up. And to give it up, she has to be humiliated. Only then can she learn to take a proper feminine pleasure in her subordination to a loving master. In these ways, the Philadelphia story, in spite of its superficial egalitarianism, is really a deeply conservative film. At least that's my opinion. It asks us as an audience to reconcile our differences with the bankers and industrialists who own the means of production, and to reject the more radical political suitor who might try to promote a redistribution of wealth. At the same time, it asks us as men and women to fall in love all over again with a modernized image of male dominance, one that can afford to be permissive in its rule over the female because ultimately she will be tied to submission by choice. It is, after all, the true form of the happiness she is entitled to pursue. We know this because the film shows us, in a subtle but subliminally powerful way, that feminine submission is the core of her sexual pleasure, to which the only alternative is the frigidity of the chaste goddess. Patriarchy has learned in this film that the real threat to companionate marriage from modern women's independence is not that women will lose their chastity. Just the opposite, the danger is that they might become too chaste. In effect, that they will lose their desire for husbands altogether. And so, the film's message is sexually permissive for its time, an attitude embodied equally in young Dinah's music hall song about the tattooed lady, and in her eager curiosity about adult sexual behavior. In Seth Lord's philandering and his wife's tolerance of it, in Liz's even greater tolerance of Mike's infatuation with Tracy, and in everyone's amused indulgence of Uncle Willie's undisguised lechery. Uncle Willie. Ha! But this sexual permissiveness is less liberal than it seems. For the story this film is telling us about relations between men and women is one in which women's sexuality is affirmed so that their sexual desire can be used to subordinate them within marriage all over again. Any woman who doesn't learn this lesson, love men, be subordinate to them, and tolerate their infidelities, is coded by the story as frigid and doomed to marriage with the likes of George Kittredge. I haven't yet given you a mapping the action overview of the film, but I'll do it next time. That'll give us a chance for a closer look at how the film's doing the things that I claimed it is.